is right here. Grab paint, experiment along with me, okay? So the first thing that I'm going to be experimenting with and I'm going to be demonstrating is I'm going to demonstrate doing what is called combing. Some of you may recognize this. Combing. It's on your sheet. So some of you may recognize this technique. Perhaps in high school, your professors called it dry brush. I used to call it dry brush. Everybody on the other side of the Mississippi generally calls it dry brush. Doesn't matter, just as long as we all know what we're talking about. So, that's a good part of being a scenic artist, is making sure that you understand what everybody is talking about. That, like, your lexicon is like you're on the same page, okay? So it was explained to me when I was writing my first edition by Howard Jones. As a matter of fact, he was like, "That's not dry brush, that's combing." I was like, okay, all right, cool. So I did some research and I was like, okay, generally on the East Coast, they always call this combing. In decorative arts, they always call this combing. So I will call this combing. But just in case you're like looking at me going, we used to do that, but it was called dry brush, right? Same. Just understand your lexicon, okay? So when you are combing, what you're doing is you're pulling paint along so that you're getting, hopefully, what is a fairly consistent, notice how I dab my brush off there at the beginning? A fairly consistent line or stroke across the surface, all right? So if you notice on this, you're going to see that it's not just lines of combing that are completely straight and just cover the whole thing. You'll be like, there's variation in that. So once you start to get a handle on just going straight, I want you to start experimenting with starting with the corner of your brush and then laying more of the brush down and then maybe picking up that corner again so that you can get a little bit of elegance into your combing technique so that you're almost be able to grain when you comb, okay? And you're going to comb all the way across these two of your squares, just like it says on these sheets that I passed out to you, okay? And as it's illustrated in that piece up there. So you're just going to experiment. Now, I want you to remember what we've talked about. Everything is an experimentation, okay? So if something sort of goes awry on you, this is the place. Like, this is a piece of bogus paper, right? We're not, like, this is not your opus here. It's bogus paper. Now, I'm going to tell you the secret of all paint techniques and for making every single paint technique work perfectly. Maybe not perfectly the first time, but essentially figuring out how to get closer to perfection. Are you ready? Viscosity. What is viscosity? Thickness. It's the relative thickness of your paint. If your technique is not working as well as you would like I wasn't getting as much pull as I wanted with my paint here, did you notice what I did? I thinned it down. Okay? Viscosity is the secret to every single paint technique. I have had so many students over the years come up to me and go, it just doesn't work. And it's like, did you try thinning down your paint? Or did you try thickening up your paint? Like, it's like squishing out from the edges. Well, then thicken your paint so it doesn't squish out from the edges, right? Or I can't get as much draw or pull on this technique as I would like. Well, then try thinning your paint. All right? So viscosity is the secret. You are going to do this standing up with extensions. Okay? All right. Look at this brush. Look at this poor, tortured soul. Right? So we can do combing techniques using just regular brushes. But honestly, it's the scrappier brushes like these that do the better combing technique, okay? But sometimes we want a more coarse combing technique. And then that's when we take chip brushes, only chip brushes, and we torture them into these shapes. But if you want like finer combing, you can just use kind of a rasty brush like this, and you can get finer combing just by letting it be its rasty old self. Now, here's the other thing about combing. If you pull too fast, the brush is going to skip. So when you are combing, I'm not saying pull your brush at a glacial pace, but slow your roll a little bit. Give the paint time to migrate to the end of the bristles. The paint comes out of the end of the bristles. So give it time to come out of the end of the bristles. I'm not going slow just for your benefit. I'm going slow when I pull my brush because that's the way the paint treatment works best. All right? Okay, so that's combing. You're all welcome to grab a brush if you want, get up on your feet and practice with combing a little bit. Yeah, and you can bring your compasses back up to the table if you're done with them. So you don't even have to be invited. Like as I'm introducing a new paint technique, you can just go, oh, I'm going to try that, and come up and grab a tool, okay? Yeah, knock my tea over, and that's like, that's your grade for the day, I'm just saying.
I saved it, so I didn't fail yet.
Paint is right here. You have small containers right there. And double up on small containers. Not everybody has to have you can share a set of containers between 2 or 3 people. Nope. You all have water buckets. So as you do this project, I'm asking you to try to keep it clean because you're learning something else in scenic artistry. You're learning how to mask. Now this is how we easy skeezy mask out paint techniques frequently. We're like, well, yeah, I could like lay a piece of tape there, but that's kind of a pain in the popo, and then I have to like take the tape off. Or we just use straight masking boards. Okay? So keep going, experiment with your dry brush. When you think of a non-paint tool, like a weird tool, in decorative arts, what's one of the first things that you think of? Sponges, right? Everything is like, it's a sponge technique, or it's a rag roll technique, right? So the reason I moved down here to sponge is you can see that my dry brush is still a little bit wet up there. Okay? So I moved down here to do a sponge technique. Now, when I was in Detroit, they redid the Fox Theater, and there's a beautiful dome above the orchestra area of the Fox Theater. They brought in USA mural painters to paint this freaking thing and do all of the stuff, and a lot of the painting is gorgeous. But whoever sponged the dome did a horrible job, okay? And it makes me annoyed to this day. So when you sponge, first of all, no sponge is the same as any other sponge. So look for the sponge that is as closely aligned to the texture you're trying to get. Some sponges have really fine texture. Some sponges have really coarse texture. Okay? So look for the sponge that has the texture that you want. We have tons of sponges here. So make your selection. I'm asking you in this square to do a 2-color sponge treatment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out with my coarse sponge, and I'm going to do a sponge treatment with a light color, and then I'm going to do my dark color over it. For most treatments, this is the path to success. Lightest color first in the treatment, on up to the darkest color. When you put light colors over dark colors, it tends to make your paint treatment look muddy. So you usually want to go from your lightest values to your darkest values. You're not quite wet enough there, and that's what's going on. So you're probably a little thick. So yeah. So now I'm going to take my sponge and I'm going to sponge this square. But notice what I'm doing. I'm turning my sponge every single time, so that I don't get a pattern that goes bop, 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 right? So I am continually turning my sponge, which is what that person who did the dome in the Fox Theater didn't do. They just got up there and went, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, come on, dude. I know you got paid, I think back then it was $58 an hour to do this. So always turn your sponge it becomes second nature after a while, after you've done it a couple of times, where you're just you find your hand automatically doing it, where you're just turning your sponge around. Also, you want your sponge to be wet enough that it sort of kisses the surface. You don't want to be going, right? Okay? You want that texture to show. Okay? So if you feel like that, grab a sponge now. Go and grab a sponge and play with the sponge. You probably were pulling a little bit too fast and maybe not quite thick enough. Or thin enough, right? Okay?
That's why I filled it out over here.
Perfect. Perfect. So as you use your sponges, what's the first thing you're going to do when you're done with your sponge? Huh? Rinse it out, right? You do not let the paint dry in the sponge. This is a tool. Granted, it's a super cheap tool, but it's a tool that's working well. Why would you shorten its life and deny somebody else the pleasure of using this tool that's worked well for you? So now I'm going to go over my fine sponging technique, or my coarse sponging technique, which is a lighter value with a darker color using a finer sponge. Once again, turning my sponge every single time. So if you find your sponge isn't giving you a good even pattern, right, and it's got like a solid in it, it might be because it's like too uneven in the distribution of paint on it. So you might have to give it a good squeeze and get that paint kind of evenly distributed throughout the sponge. Now this first technique that I showed you, combing, you will not be able to use on your first couple of projects. But you can use a brush with your no brush projects as long as the brush doesn't actually touch the surface. Ha ha ha. Right? So this leads us to a really useful and often used technique in scenic artistry.
Oh.
Spatter.
Yep.
It's not splatter, it's spatter. When you say splatter to me, I know what you're talking about, but that's not what it's called. Happens all the time. There's usually someone who gets that in their head. Now they're probably going to get it in their head because of my lecture. When you choose a spatter brush, you want to choose a brush that has a fairly long bristle. Okay? It's harder to spatter with brushes that have really short bristles. So when you're spattering, there are two ways that you can spatter. There's tons of ways. There's really no end to the ways that you can spatter. But there are tons of ways to spatter. Actually, we're going to do even spatter colors first, and then I will show you spatter and drag. So we'll do this side first, which is even spatter colors. And I'm going to do spattering two different ways on this. Gotcha. All right. I'm going to do a coarse spatter and a fine spatter, okay? So to do a coarse spatter, what you want to do is back down to viscosity, y'all. If your paint is really, really viscous, your spatter is not going to work very well. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with the sponge. I'm going to start with my light spatter, do a coarse spatter, and then I'm going to do a fine spatter over the top of it. So you want your paint for your spatter to be fairly thin, okay? If it's thick, it's just not going to drop off the bristles very well. So for this spatter, I want it to be coarse, so I want nice big fat drops. So the way I'm going to get those big fat drops is I'm just going to have the brush be really, really full, and I'm going to lightly warble it around and get those nice big fat drops. If you can't get big fat drops off your brush doing this, it's probably because your paint is too thick. So it used to be, back in the day, whenever we finished a backdrop, it was just a thing that I was taught when I was first starting to steam paint. Back then they were like, now do a dirty water wash. So you'd take your dirty paint water and you just spatter it all over the drop. And that would just sort of add like kind of a come and go to it, almost like a photographic like blurring to it. Still a very legitimate technique. It's just that like kind of the presentation of steam painting, scenic art has changed a little over the centuries. So now using the same brush, I'm going to do a fine spatter. And technically, I should be letting this dry before I do the fine spatter, but we are forging ahead. So still using paint that is very, very thin, but now I'm wicking some of the paint off the bristles, okay? So it's not quite so full. And I'm going to be hitting it against the meat of my hand. And you can see that I can get a finer spatter doing that. So, and the fan is on. It's not bothering me that much, but be aware of your fan when you're doing this. Okay, and I'm not hitting my hand super hard. And I'm trying to pay attention to getting an even disbursement of spatter color here, okay? Now you can see if you look at this closely, because the coarse spatter is underneath it, in a couple of places now it's just running together, which is why you want it to dry in between, okay? Now, using that same technique, I'm going to do a spatter and drag on my wood, okay? I'm going to do a green spatter and wood. Who cares? It's my wood. I can do whatever I want. This isn't dry yet, but I'm putting my masking board on it, which means it's going to mess it up a little bit. But once again, we are forging ahead. So, to do a spatter and drag, I need two brushes. Thank you. You need one brush that's clean and preferably dry. And if it's not dry, just take a rag and like get as much of the dampness off the bristles as you can, okay? And then it will perform well. And then another brush that's your brush that has the color in it. So you can do this with a coarse spatter or a fine spatter, but if it's for wood, a fine spatter is usually the way you want to go. So I'm going to lightly do my spatter on it. And then, while it's still juicy, pull my brush through it. You can pull your brush in two directions if you want. On bogus paper or craft paper, it's just not going to work that well because it's pretty much like going to go in and just stay there. But if you're working on a slicker surface and you want your spatter to pull in both directions, you can do that easily. Okay? And then this adds like a sense of a rough element to this wood. Coarsens it up. Right? All right? So it adds another texture. So you're welcome to go ahead and try some spatter and drag techniques. Try your spatter technique. Of course you can do it. Yep, of course you can. Okay, so in terms of decorative arts, what's another tool that you keep hearing about besides sponging? What else do they do all the time in decorative arts? Huh? What kind of rolling? They do cut rollers. What else do they do, though, in terms of rolling? It has rolling is in there. What's another technique that they do all the time? They're like, do this technique when you do your decorative art. Rag rolling. Rag rolling.
Oh. Didn't we do that for the marble and Mr. Arbor?
To a certain extent, we did some rolling over it. So we're going to do rag rolling on this section. Now you can do rag rolling technique with any kind of tool that is essentially fabric or fabric light. It mostly depends on how much that tool is going to hold on to moisture. Like you don't want to take nylon deer fencing and try to rag roll with it because it's not going to hold any paint. It's just going to be a mess. So you usually want a fabric that has some sort of weave to it. Right here, I mostly just have jersey rags. And I'm going to use this rag right here. It's a good size for rag rolling, but you can use terry cloth. You can use burlap. You can use so many different kinds of rags. And the other thing, can you see if you can find a roller that has rag wrapped around it? The other thing that you can do is you can do a different kind of rag rolling technique where you wrap the rag around a roller. And so you use a roller with a rag wrapped around it to create texture. So first I'm going to dip my rag in water and then squeeze it out really, really well. But I want to make sure that the paint permeates the entire rag. Okay? And then I'm going to put the rag in my paint, squeeze it out a little bit so it's not just dripping, but it's still really, really full of paint. And then I'm literally going to roll my rag across the surface. And it's going to create an organic pattern . wherever the edge of the folds come in contact with the surface. So you want to flip your rag over a lot. And basically you're just kind of rolling a bag of rolled up rag. Now you can do other kinds of rag rolling where you like turn your rag into a twist and you get a different kind of texture when it's in a twist, right? You can also you can also use your rag almost like you use your sponge. So you can take your rag and you can kind of ball it up until it's got like a textural shape that you can hold on to like you do a sponge. And you're kind of happy with that shape that it's making. And then you can take your rag and basically almost sponge your pattern on it. Turning it, same way you do with a sponge, in between so you don't get patterning. Once again, viscosity. And I'm going to come clean and say that since this was the paint that I just used for spatter, it's probably a little bit thin for a rag roll because it's like soaking in a little bit too much and it's not giving me as much oomph as I would like. It's a little thin, right? So your paint can be a little bit thicker for rag roll. All right? So combing, spattering, rag rolling, sponging, we've done so far. What else are we going to try? We're going to do, my favorite, Schlapitska. So we're going to do a technique called Schlapitska. Y'all, when I first started college, Burrismeyer and Cole's book had just come out, and for the first time ever, there was a whole chapter on scenic art. Okay? And in that chapter, they showed a technique called Schlapitska. Every freaking design that we got had Schlapitska in it because it was like a fad. It was so weird. So I didn't know it was weird at the time, but looking back on it, I'm like, that was weird. So we almost never do Schlapitska anymore, but you get to do Schlapitska because Schlapitska is fun. And I just want to make sure that it also kind of helps free up your mind. It's like, yes, anything can be a paint tool. Now, at my shop in Arkansas, I have an array of feather dusters that go from chicken feathers to turkey feathers to ostrich feathers and pheasant feathers. I have all these different, and what I use them for a lot is the next technique, which I'm going to show you, which is flogging. Because I do a lot of flogging when I have to do fields of grass, right? But first we're just going to do Schlapitska. So we're going to do it once again with two different tools. I'm going to thicken my paint up just a little bit. Now, Schlapitska and flogging are not clean techniques. They're kind of messy. So you want to immerse not all the way up to the hilt, but you want to immerse your feathers in the paint, okay? And then you usually kind of have to like wick it off, and really, honestly, the best way to do that is with your hand, okay? Then you want to open up the feathers a little bit. You don't want them to be all sticky together. And then you start spinning. Spin, drop, spin, drop, spin, drop. Don't spin on the paper. Spin and drop, spin and drop. You can tell this little wrist movement has been key in a couple of techniques we've done now, right? Sponging, rag rolling, and now Ślepiska. Spin and drop. So now I'm going to use another color and another kind of feather duster to do the next one. Same thing, wicking it out a little bit, separating the feathers, getting a good spin going, spin and drop, spin, and you can see this is a turkey feather. That was chicken feathers before. This is turkey feathers now. So you can see I get a different pattern with turkey feathers. Yep. Okay? So that's Ślepiska. They said in Bursmeyer and Cole that it like kind of looked like flocking on wallpaper. It doesn't look like flocking on wallpaper. Just saying. Doesn't look like that at all. But whatever. Who cares? Okay. It's just fun. All right. Now we're going to take that same tool and, thank you, we're going to do flogging. So we're going to use a feather duster, but we're going to use it in a different way. So instead of spinning and plopping it down on the surface, I'm going to flog. Now you can use just about any kind of fabric or something tied to a stick to do flogging with. So what I want you to do when you flog is I want you to like try to get kind of, if you can, a little bit of gradation in your flogging so that you're moving from a finer flog stroke to a slightly more aggressive. And then pull that flogging stroke out a little bit so that you lengthen it. Okay? All right, so mess around with flogging. This, in organic subject matter, can be a lifesaver technique. As can Ślepiska if you're just trying to fill in what feels like background foliage really fast, right? All right. So these are like some of our basic techniques. Oh, thank you. So Sophie brought over a rag roller. Okay. And I'm just going to be really naughty and go ahead and like dirty this up. So when we have to like do an organic breakup on things, sometimes we just do So I want, once again, viscosity is key. I knew that the viscosity of that paint coming straight out of the bucket was way too thick, so I thinned it down a little bit. And then I'm going to charge my rag rolling tool. Yes? No, I did not rotate. Okay? So rag rolling technique is really, really useful for, like I said, if you have like a big surface area where you're trying to get an organic breakup happening. And depending on how you wrap the rag around your roller, it will change the way that pattern works out, okay? So that you can do it in all sorts of different ways. So other tools that you can do flogging techniques with. You can literally do flogging techniques. This is just a homemade tool, a bunch of yarn stuck to a stick. So that we can get flogging techniques. That you can do. And you can always stick the feather duster in the end of an extension, okay? And then a student a few years ago for a grass technique used this tool. And this tool, like, it has issues. Like, it's not meant to hold on to paint very well, but the student wanted to get some really fine kind of broken up grass technique. And so even though the bristle is really long on this, like it gives you this really nice, very organic feeling breakup, okay? All right. So we've done like all of these different sort of techniques. There's nothing in scenic art that isn't a paint tool, okay? Like anything that you're like, gee, would this be a good paint tool? Like go ahead and give it a shot. Like you never know. Okay, so one of the other tools that we use quite a bit are rollers. I'm never going to get him off again. There we go. That's better. Okay. So rollers normally are used for just putting your paint on, a wall. Know that when you do roll paint on a wall or on a flat surface, you always do a thing that's called back rolling. So when you're using a roller to base with, if you're just using it straight up flat to like cover square footage, you always like put your paint on and then you come back over and you will do what's called back rolling over the area that you just painted to smooth it out Because when you first roll paint on a flat surface with a wool roller, you don't see it, but there are tiny little pinholes that didn't actually get the paint. So if you back roll over what you just rolled your paint onto, that surface you just pulled the paint onto, it will fill in those little pinholes. It will also fill in the reels of paint that are left from the edge of the roller. It'll also smooth those out. So when you are rolling, you always roll and then back roll. The other thing, when you are rolling paint on for a base coat, you want to think directionally how you want to do this, like how you want it to look. Like if you're doing a wall, you don't go, you should try to keep your roller strokes as vertical as possible. And then back roll vertically over your roller strokes. But sometimes we're doing something in scenic art where the rolling is for a very organic surface. And so sometimes it's like it's okay, but any way that you put your paint base on, your base color, should reflect what's happening to the surface underneath. All right? So if it's organic, your paint strokes or your roller strokes should be omnidirectional. Okay? But if it's like really, really straight, then it's like, okay, generally in theater, when we are rolling like, say, a whole portal that's one solid color, we try to keep our roller strokes parallel, so different from painting walls. We try to keep up roller strokes parallel to the stage deck. So our roller strokes are horizontal, and that's because of the way stage light works. You see the flaws more easily in vertical roller marks than you do in horizontal roller marks, okay? So it's usually if you're just doing it straight, you want to think about the orientation of the scenery and have your roller direction be parallel to the stage floor, okay? Now, when is a roller not a roller? When we use it in scenic art for any other freaking thing we want to use it for, right? So we use rollers for all sorts of fun things. We can make all these masking boards, like, well, let's see. Is this the tree? This is the tree, right? Okay. So we're going to do, I'm just going to initially, with my roller, I'm going to put in a tree trunk. So when you work with a roller, you can work with it so that it is just doing a killer job and laying the paint on really, really solid. Or you can do what we call a dry roller technique. So when you're doing a dry roller technique, you want the roller to skip. Okay? So that I'm actually creating some texture. And we use sponge rollers. We use dry rollers with stuff wrapped around them. We use dry rollers with rubber bands wrapped around them in organic sort of directions. We use rollers in all sorts of ways. You can also use rollers to actually create chiaroscuro content. You can use the edge of your roller to create fairly tight lines, which you will be seeing me do when I demonstrate your no brush project. So you can get a lot of use out of a roller. I have painted entire drops before using nothing but rollers. Okay? So you can use rollers to be texture tools. You can use them to be edging tools. You can use them for in all sorts of interesting ways. You can also cut patterns out on rollers. So we have some pattern rollers here. Is this a good one? Sort of. We don't really have a good pattern roller in here for like doing the border. And then same thing, rinse that puppy out right away. Actually, as long as I'm at this, why don't I go ahead and finish the tree? So I'm going to paint a tree entirely with a roller. Thank you so much. So, first of all, I'm going to put in some background leaves. So, when I was in Germany, we checked into this hotel room that was the tiniest hotel room I have ever been in my entire life. And I looked down the street. We did have a beautiful view down a boulevard. And I saw this gorgeous mural of a forest that was just, and this was before printing was even an option, right? This was in an era, this is how old I am, when they were still hand painting billboards. And I was like, I have to know how they did that mural. So I was like, in the morning I was like, we're going in that direction to get our coffee. And I looked at this mural, and the entire mural had been painted with rollers. The entire thing. But from that distance away, it looked absolutely real. Just photographic. It was beautiful. So that's when I really realized how useful rollers could be in scenic art just by themselves. Not even, like I was aware of, creating pattern rollers and stuff like that, but that was amazing. So since then, like I have like gone, oh, what, you need this like in a day? I'm just going to pull out the roller. I'm going to make this thing happen really, really fast. All right? So what I want you to do is I want you to try to paint. Don't go crazy. Lots of people like create tree trunks that are like 8-part tree trunks. Don't do that. Single, somewhere between 1 and 3 trunk parts. And like try to put in like a little bit of like leaf work using your roller. Just mess around with it a little bit, okay? Does anybody want to play with this? Sure you do. Get on your feet. You guys are like, you're sitting too much. Get on your feet. Suzette? All right. So, other things that we can do with rollers. Like sometimes rollers can like just save our lives. Like it's like I've got to get all of this done and I've got to get it done really, really fast. I need to like put this framework in this molding. or I need to put this border in this wallpaper. Yes. Yes, you are. Yeah, I said that earlier. You are going to let the paint dry.
So do you like this color, the colors that you're using, like you colors, maybe not the blue red, the brown, but you want us to go in?
No, use whatever colors you want. You've got 6 choices here. This is exploration. I want to see a good exploration, but I also want to see it tidy, because good scenic artists are tidy. Okay. So I need to put a border that goes around this, let's say. One of the first things that I'm going to do, because I want to miter my corners on my border. I didn't mean to grab that. Oh yeah, we're doing great for time. This is the part of the video where everybody who's watching the video is looking at my butt. Always happens, every video. Sorry. Huh?
I feel like that's just scenic art.
It's just scenic art. I feel like we should paint scenic art butts like they used to have lawn butts. We should have scenic art butts. Renee would have really gotten into those. Okay, so I'm going to do a border, and I have these miters, but it's like I can't get my roller to stop on a dime, right? Need one more piece of paper. There you go. So yes, you are, just like I said it earlier, but let's say it again. You are going to probably have to let things dry a little bit more because I am zooming along. It's a demonstration. Your time is valuable. I know, they're little trees. It's adorable. And obviously, you would let it dry as you went along. You will probably need to recharge your roller in between every pass. Viscosity is important. So you're going to get mitered corners when you do your roller. Pattern roller. Don't care what pattern you use. There we go. So for pattern roller work and for stamp work, your paint needs to be kind of thick. Because otherwise, if it's too thin, it's just going to get gushy like it did in that corner. Okay? So you're going to want your paint to be fairly viscous, more along the lines of half and half or heavy cream, okay? Try and do a couple of patterns. Miter those corners. Got a little off. Okay? All right. Last thing that you're going to do, you're going to create wallpaper. Okay? So you're going to create your own wallpaper pattern. So what am I going to do for my wallpaper pattern? You can use any of the techniques that you've seen here for your wallpaper pattern, okay? So, hand me that feather duster. I'm going to do a fairly viscous little Schlapitska, you think, kind of thing here to do a background breakup. I know. It's adorable. I'm going to kind of do it dense. Hand me that line stick over there. Okay, I'm going to use this janky line stick. Line got off. I'm going to go ahead and use the roller that I already had. Could you give me a dauber? Thanks. Love daubers. We'll come back to that. Can she do it? Thank you. Daubers. They're not just for playing bingo. Okay, paint stamps. We have a wonderful assortment of paint stamps for you all to mess around with. Okay? Now, I didn't say this was going to be attractive wallpaper, y'all. I think this guy's going to be too big. Looks like that's about the right shape. So for paint stamps too, you want your paint to be fairly thick. See how I'm just wiggling it a little bit? Okay. And then this is definitely going to run, but you get the idea. Oh my God, we need this backing flap painted because it's got to be on stage in an hour. Ta-da! All right. The most important part of scenic artistry. What was the most important thing in terms of all the techniques that I talked to you about? Yes. Viscosity. If it's not working, your paint is probably too viscous. Yes. You will let it dry between steps. Okay? Also, in scenic artistry, our job, our approach, our whole reason for being is that we're doing this stuff for money. It's either the production company we're working for, or it's the vendor that we're working for, or it's the client that we're working for. And what do they want from us? A good product, but what else? What else do they want from us? Huh? Of course. And what else do they want from us? Huh? We'll get to the story later, but yes. Fast. They're paying you to do this stuff. They don't want you to take 3 days to do the wallpaper if you could do it in 30 minutes and still have it look really good. Okay? So we try to think of the most direct way to paint and get the product and the appearance that we want. I'm not saying that we don't want good quality. I'm not saying that we don't want it to be art. I'm not saying that you don't take the time to finesse. I'm not saying that you don't try to make it sublime, if you can. But you're always thinking about how can I get there as quickly as possible, which is why all of these techniques are so useful. It's like, am I going to take my time if I need a breakup pattern in the back and go nee with a brush? Like, that would just be silly. When I could just go wop, rop, 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 up. Done, right? So you're always going to be thinking of that, and that's where these texture tools are so important. And that's why we teach you this first, so that you can understand and start to develop sort of a muscle reflex to not reach for the brush the first time every time, but to like go, oh, wait a minute, I could like do this really fast with a roller or a sponge or even a feather duster, okay? There are all sorts of tools over there that we will be continue to explore, like in the black and white project, we'll have like other kinds of tools out that are similar to the tools that we just used, but a little bit different. So we'll mess with that. Okay? There's one other technique that I would really love to show you real quick. Can you get me a wood block? Is blocking. So sometimes a paint tool isn't like a piece of rag or isn't something that's necessarily like created just to absorb paint. So a lot of times we do what we call blocking or carding techniques, okay? So if you want to explore with a blocking technique, you are more than welcome to do that on your piece over your combing project. So there's a couple of ways to do blocking. And I know this isn't on your one sheet, just whatever. Like I said, it is an exploration. That's what we do. We explore, sometimes in the moment. So you can do blocking a couple of different ways. Sorry, he has to pee. Okay, there we go. So you can spatter the paint on. Coarse spatter works best, but you can do it with a fine spatter. You can experiment with it. And then you literally take the block and you pull through the paint. So it's sort of like spatter and drag, only you're using a block to do it, okay? The other way that you can block is by actually applying the paint to the block. so that you can be a little bit more specific about where you're blocking that color, and put it on and pull it. Okay? We also do this, and we'll do a lot with this when we do the demonstration for your grass project, your black and white grass project. All right? I'm going to show you more carding. I'm going to show you carding technique, okay? So these are the techniques that I want you to experiment on those pieces of paper that I had you put your grid on. All right? If you look over there, that is my finished stencil, or my finished pounce, excuse me, over there. Speaking of, I'm glad I accidentally said stencil. There's another technique that we are not investigating in this class. And that's stenciling, which is another way to create pattern, motif, wallpaper. So stenciling we usually use a stipple brush for this, but this will work just fine. Stippling is a technique of just bouncing the brush up and down on the surface. So this is stippling, okay? Now you can stipple so that you create pattern like that. Or you can stipple to the point where you are actually filling in a section completely, which is what you do when you stipple through a stencil. Now, a lot of people spray through stencils. Dry rollers tend to work okay on stencils. My problem with spray is it gets so much media on the surface that you don't actually save any time. You feel like you're saving time because the media goes on so fast, but then you have to stop after every second or third repeat and clean the stencil off because it's got so much extra paint on it. Not a problem when you stipple. So we actually have stipple brushes that work more efficiently than this one is working, but we just stipple the color through the stencil. I have another technique I use where I actually put really, really thin but chromatic color in a pre-valve, and I lightly pre-valve over the surface and then stipple over the pre-valve, okay? And that speeds things up, especially if it's a darker tone that's going on to a lighter tone, all right? So stenciling is another way that we do pattern work in scenic art frequently. So there we have it. You're going to finish your tools and techniques. How are your pounces? Is everybody done with your pounce? Does anybody want to show me your pounce, or do you feel like your pounce is like kind of looking like that? If you want to show me your pounce, you are welcome to. Next week, I'll be demonstrating your black and white project. All right? So I'm going to be using a lot of these techniques, but just in a smaller format on that black and white project. Okay? All right, questions?